So I'm gonna tell you about our panel today. Theresa Bratton is going to be our moderator. She's a graduate of Vanderbilt University, trained in pediatrics, allergy, and immunology at McGill in Montreal, clinical practice of allergy in Greensboro since 1981, and has taught at University of Mississippi, Wake Forest, and UNC Pediatrics. She is a fifth-generation physician. She's married with 3 children, 3 grandchildren. Her husband is a retired neurosurgeon, son is a radiologist, daughter is a clinical and research psychologist, and has a son who's not in medicine. He's in alternative energy financing. One of our speakers is Dr. Kelly Leggett. She's an obstetrician and gynecologist. She was born and raised in High Point, completed her undergraduate in business administration at Chapel Hill, a year of research at Duke, and completed medical school at Wake Forest. So she hit all of the big universities except for state, I guess. She integrates technology, data analytics, design thinking, lean methodologies to produce better, safer, and more cost-effective healthcare experiences for our community. When she is not following her passion for healthcare, especially women's healthcare, she enjoys spending time with her husband, Jim, 3 children, and the best golden doodle in the world. Our last speaker is Steve Friedland, and he told me to be sure I mentioned that he is my neighbor. So, Steve is a founding faculty member at Elon Law School, located just down the street here. He teaches and writes about criminal and constitutional law and was an assistant U.S. attorney for Washington, D.C. when in law practice. He graduated from Harvard, the notation says a very long time ago. So we're going to go ahead and get our panel up here as soon as they're ready and get started.
Stand out here. Can everyone hear me if I don't use this? Okay, I'll just do this. How's that? That works? Okay, because I know there's been some reverberation from it. Is this still pretty good? Okay. I'll leave it there. Okay, so we're going to talk today really about the Constitution. So I'm going to talk about the Dobbs case, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, but it's important to get a little background. So I'm going to actually go into constitutional law, and we're going to have a mini con law class before we get into the actual case. So today my goals, quickly, give a quick overview of con law, examine the right to privacy and Roe, and then talk about what's next. Those are the 3 things we hopefully will get done in about the next 20 minutes. But first, it's time for a quiz. Let's see what you know or don't know. You ready? True, false. The Constitution is a source of law interpreted by courts and Congress through advisory opinions. Good. It's interpreted only by courts, not just the Supreme Court. The federal courts interpret the Constitution. The courts really interpret the Constitution. Where does it say that in the Constitution? It does not. But some judge, actually 1803, a famous justice, John Marshall, said they really intended to have us interpret it. Well, nice going. It's called the big power grab. And since that time, courts have interpreted the Constitution. And it can't be an advisory opinion, at least in the federal courts. In some states, it can. But the courts, that's their job. What's the job of the legislature? Good, they're supposed to make the law. They've not done exactly a wonderful job in the last couple of years. Kind of had some divisions, right? Where they haven't exactly made the laws, which have made, by the way, the courts even more important. The ebb and flow now is moved towards the courts because of that. And what's the executive's job? They're supposed to enforce the law. Where do I put prosecutors? They're part of the executive branch. Same with the police. So 3 big branches of government: legislative, judicial, and executive. They all are supposed to have different roles. But like siblings, they all want more. So that's what we see going on the last couple of years. True, false? Like this question. Marijuana is legal in Colorado, Oregon, and Virginia. And that's not the right answer. It is not true. And here's why. It's not because it's decriminalized. It's because we actually have two governments in this country, two sovereigns, federal and state. And when there's a dispute between feds and states, who wins? In this corner, weighing 845 pounds in the blue trunks, the federal government. In this corner, weighing 65 pounds in the red trunks, states. So happens the Controlled Substances Act says under the federal government and the federal law, marijuana is unlawful. So the feds are just not enforcing their law, which is why many people in Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Virginia have mattresses stuffed with money because they can't go to the federally insured banks. So kind of interesting, two governments. And we're going to see this relates, all of this relates to abortion anyway, and whether the feds can pass a law and the states pass a law. And who wins if there is. So what I'm really saying is, if the state has a law saying abortion is lawful, and the feds have a law saying it's not, who's going to win? Federal government trumps. There's something called the Supremacy Clause in Article 6, Section 2, saying the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and federal law is supreme as well. Okay, true, false. Law is a special type of politics. Okay, I know everyone wants to say true, but John Roberts says it isn't. And we already heard John Roberts and Elena Kagan this summer having very different views on where the court's going, and that's why there's such low confidence in the court. Actually, judges are not supposed to engage in politics. Law is supposed to be a science, and it's supposed to follow precedent, this thing called stare decisis. And that's where this whole issue lies. Are they really following stare decisis, or are they waking up in the morning and letting their ideology, their own background, their politics control? And we'll leave that for another day, because that's a long discussion that we often have. Number 4, the Constitution affirms slavery. Okay, and a lot of people should be afraid to answer that one. Greatest document in American democracy affirms it in 3 different places. It was a compromise. It legitimized it and actually said, you can't change slavery states until 1808, or Congress. So it actually said, we are now going to codify, in a sense, slavery. So the document itself, for as much as we extol it, actually legitimized and codified it. And of course, the only way we ended up taking it away was not 1808, when they could have, was the Civil War. The right to marriage and privacy are expressly stated in the Constitution. True or false? False. Good, and therein lies the problem. This is implied by judicial interpretation. How about the right to vote? It's not in there either. The right to vote is not expressly stated. How about the right to intermarriage? Not stated either. So we now see, if you're going to take away one thing that's implied, we have this possibility of what's called the slippery slope. Possibility of tyranny by the judicial branch, which is what has been brought up by some about this whole area. True, false, the right to live with family, use contraceptives, and choose abortion are all within the right to privacy. Well, this was true until June. Now, 2 out of the 3 are in there. You actually have a constitutional right. There was actually a law, believe it or not, in Cleveland, saying you had to live, you can only live with your nuclear family, not extended family. They struck that down, saying you have a right to live with any family members, including extended family. And there is a right to use contraceptives implied in the Constitution. And this is what may be next in terms of what the Supreme Court handles. Remember, no advisory opinions. It wasn't before them as to whether there still is a right to contraceptives. Justice Thomas, in his concurrence in Dobbs, talked about this and said we should consider all of these other parts as well as just abortion. Okay, true, false. The Constitution requires 9 justices. Good, it's false. That's been the case. It's about custom. And there's a lot of custom on the Supreme Court. When they recuse themselves, when they hear cases, it's up to custom. And before the Civil War, it varied. After the Civil War, it's been 9. And I'm going to add one other question. That's the end of our quiz, but here's my last question. What year was the first woman elected to Congress? Since we're in the League of Women Voters here. And where? And actually, I heard 1920, which would have been, I think, a natural suggestion because we had suffrage, right? 19th Amendment, we had 1919. It was before then. A woman was elected to Congress before women has a right to vote. It was 1917, Jeanette Rankin, Montana. And interesting person, she ran as a pacifist. And she was the only person to vote against World War I and entering World War II for the United States. So actually, she was unelected somewhere in the 20s and was reelected in the late 30s and was able to vote twice against both world wars. So Jeanette Rankin, kind of an interesting footnote to history. She was a suffragette who was a progressive, as they called her, and elected again 1970. Okay, time for a little constitutional law. So here is your big picture. We have government powers, and that's what the Constitution's about. It's about the government and powers. And of course, we have federal, state, and we know what some of the powers are. Tax, spend. By the way, is there any limit in the Constitution to spending? Kind of a big problem, right? Even when our country was founded, were we in debt? Yeah, kind of 40 million. Wars cost money. So unfortunately, Congress has a credit card and there's no limit, and it doesn't say when you have to pay it back. So there's no issue as to why perhaps we are in the place we're in. Commerce Clause power. That's a really big power of Congress. How does Congress regulate marijuana? Commerce Clause. How are they going to regulate abortion? Commerce Clause. They cannot regulate it based on health, safety, welfare, and morals. That's only for states. Congress has limited powers, although we know it's not really quite limited, as many people have seen. So, we have all these powers, but there are rights. Due process of law is a limit on the government. Equal protection is a limit on government. Freedom of speech, limit on government. Everyone see it's all about government. It's not about private entities. Facebook is not up here. Neither is Amazon. And now we know why the Constitution is not a real help with Facebook, other companies limiting speech, etc. It's not a First Amendment issue. Okay, and now we're getting towards abortion. There are fundamental rights. They're found expressly in the Constitution. The First Amendment is a fundamental right to speech and religion. Fifth Amendment, privilege against self-incrimination. And sometimes they're implied in the Constitution. They're implied if they're deeply rooted in the history of our country. Like what? Voting's a good one. Voting is one that's clearly part of our history, our historical tradition. Now, what's the significance of being a fundamental right? It means the states and the federal government, keep your hands off. Unless you have the best reason possible for interfering, you got to leave it alone. What happened in Dobbs? Justice Alito took Roe versus Wade and the right to privacy, and they said abortion is no longer a fundamental right. It's not deeply rooted. It's not expressed. It's just one of the regular rights, like who can put on eyeglasses in public. And what does that mean? States and feds can regulate any time they want, as long as it's reasonable. As long as it's reasonable. So, fundamental right is when, again, the courts look really carefully at it. It's like if you had a curfew coming home at 11 o'clock, You came home at 11:01, they're not going to look at it very carefully. But if you came home at 3 a.m., the car had a dent in it, and your hair was on fire, that's called a fundamental right. You are not going to pass go, you're grounded. So states and federal government, when it's a fundamental right, keep away, keep out. So right to privacy is a fundamental right. When did it start? Wow, back in the 1920s, believe it or not. It's not just a current thing. In 1923, people wanted to send their kids to private school. Court said you have a fundamental right to do that, or to teach your children a foreign language. 1942, they had laws in states requiring sterilization. Eugenics was a big thing in the 1920s and 30s here, in the teens, very big. It was even within the Supreme Court. Justice Holmes said, if someone is not mentally right, go ahead and sterilize them. They finally said the right to procreation is fundamental. No more sterilization. That was 1942. And finally in 65, Griswold versus Connecticut, they said the right to use contraceptives is fundamental. But there was a problem with that case. They said the right comes from the penumbras of the Bill of Rights. What are the Bill of Rights? First 10 amendments to the Constitution. Bill of Rights. That's what James Madison said. We're not comfortable just passing the Constitution. We want more. They proposed 12. They adopted 10 amendments. And they said they're in the penumbras. It's like the rings of Saturn. What's the problem in saying that? They're putting on their infrared glasses and saying, somewhere out there is this right. And the problem is, it's easy to counter that and say what? If they had meant to include it, they would have said so. Instead of putting them in these rings of Saturn, they would have put it on the planet in the document and wrote it out. So that brings us finally to Roe versus Wade. We've done our little prep. Roe basically said, here's this Texas law, which banned abortion unless a woman's life was in danger. There's a right to privacy that includes abortion. It's a fundamental right, and therefore, you can't interfere. And where is it from? Take your pick now, the penumbras or the due process clause. And this is not a great argument as well, because if you're a judge, you should be saying what? Here's where it comes from, not take your pick, one out of two. So it's been criticized for that. Now, was Roe absolute? No, there were other interests. The state's interest in life was recognized there, and the mother's health was recognized. So that's why they came up with viability and the trimester approach. Justice Blackmun wrote it, that's what he said. And first trimester, no abortion. Second trimester, protect the woman's health. Third trimester, you can prohibit it. And that's the way the Supreme Court wrote it. What's the problem with this? And I'm just trying to show you, here's where things were criticized. This sounds like what? Legislation. It sounds more like legislation than talking about an interpretation of the existing Constitution. And we'll talk a little bit about why this came about, kind of interesting too, knowing the background. 92, new case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. They abandoned the trimester approach. And now it's just, was there an undue burden on the right to choose? Supreme Court can change it, right? They're the ultimate arbiters. They can say what it is. Justice Brennan would have his clerks come to him when they started out, and he said, what's the most important thing on the Supreme Court? And they're new clerks. And they said, I don't know. And he'd go like this to him. And they say, what's that? And he said, it's the number 5. That's the most important thing. You need 5 people. And now, we all know about that, right? It takes 5. Who's on the court makes a difference. And the justices know that too. So some of them change. We can talk about Justice Roberts, who's now in the middle, who's trying to keep things together and not having a lot of success so far, and probably won't. So anyway, new test, no undue burden. Now, here's your context.
Who was the guy who wrote Roe versus Wade? Harry Blackman. What was his job before he went and became a judge? He actually was the general counsel at the Mayo Clinic. So that explains a lot and why he was so interested in science and had, here's how we're going to do it. He knew a lot more than the other justices about science, about medicine, about what was going on. That's what Harry Blackman did. Who's Norma McCorvey? She was right. She actually had her third child at the age of 21. That's what this was about. She then changed sides and became someone who believed she was wrong, and then apparently near her death said, I was paid. So there's a big documentary out about it, and no one really knows which side she was truthful about, but she ended up having a tough life, drugs, and lots of other issues. Her mother took one of her children and made her sign adoption papers. Lots of horrible things happened. She was the famous person in Roe versus Wade. So, right to privacy, what does it protect now? Unclear. Is it freedom from government interference, from disclosure, or freedom to make medical choices? A lot of different views on this as to what is included, or ultimately, the freedom to make your choice about your own body, autonomy. And a lot of people think it's the latter. It should be about autonomy, and it's not just freedom from disclosure. But there's a lot of flexibility in that. Okay, Dobbs. June 24th of this year, the world changed for a lot of people. Almost 50 years, we had Roe. Now we have this case. It overturned Roe and Casey. Can the court do that? Yes, anytime it wants. And they said it wasn't part of history. Now, interestingly, I have an issue with this because were they trained in history? Not one bit. And now they're saying we're the historians who are going to tell you what our history is like. So they can do what they want, and they're now saying we're going to be the historians. Blackman said we're going to make decisions about medicine to a limited extent, but now they're saying we're going to make decisions about history. And so they held abortion's no longer an implied fundamental right because it's not deeply rooted in our history and tradition. Well, a lot of law professors have argued on both sides about this. There's a lot of issues that this brings up. But what does this allow? States to prohibit abortion. And of course, what happened right away, we had in states, we had trigger laws, right? North Carolina too, there was a law before Roe. It's now back in effect. We have that in a lot of places. We have in Kansas the possibility of a constitutional amendment in the state that was rejected. We're going to see this going on. We now have, I hate to say it, new state versus state issues. This is going to be a state versus state issue in the foreseeable future. So, the future. What's coming next? Abortion pill regulation. Because once they can regulate abortion, it's now abortion pills. Can Congress regulate it? Yeah, it's commerce. It's commerce. So Congress can regulate it. States are going to try to regulate it. We're going to see that. What's remaining of the right to privacy? Justice Thomas talked about that, although he did not talk about interracial marriage. That could have been included in it. We'll see how far they're willing to go. Same-sex marriage and intimacy. Where does it say anything about it in the Constitution? No. So that could be a next case coming through as well. And I already said interracial marriage. And what's the role of religion in the First Amendment? That has played a role in this as well. So, and of course, and this is where I go to Dr. Leggett, the next thing is going to be miscarriages. And what are doctors going to do now in treating patients? The judges said, this is just our bit, and they said, we're out of here. And now the question is, how do you treat patients? And I know Dr. Leggett has a lot to say on that, and I'm done. So thank you.
I'm a microphone person. I feel like I'm Oprah talking a little bit, makes me feel good. So he's gonna do my slides for me. So again, I'm Kelly Leggett. I am an OB-GYN. I'm board certified, which is very important. That means that I keep up with my CME and have to pass exams to have the certification. I do practice here in Greensboro. I want to make very clear that these views are my personal views and not of that of my employer. So basically, I wanted to go over medical terminology because we in medicine use abbreviations for everything. Yes, I can. And then also talk about how Roe v. Wade being overturned affects all of these different aspects of our community. So a medical abortion, that is where you take pills to end a pregnancy. There is a series of 2 pills. The first one is mifepristone, and that is the brand names over there, and it's an anti-progestin. And then misoprostol, so what that does is takes away the progestin which supports the pregnancy. You have to have progesterone to support the pregnancy. So it terminates that. And then the misoprostol is a medication that also induces contractions, so it expels the contents of the uterus. You do medical abortions up to 10 weeks. It has to be in millimeter sizes. These are not like large babies coming out. This is millimeter size. And so we only use it up to 10 weeks. This is available in North Carolina. Mifepristone is highly regulated and also very expensive. Pharmacies like CVS and Walgreens do not carry it. It takes a special pharmacy. So like Planned Parenthood would be a place where you could get mifepristone. Cytotec has lots of uses, which this gets very interesting because what could happen is if you see a prescription for Cytotec, is this a secret abortion occurring? Or is it also for gastroesophageal GERD, we use abbreviations, gastroesophageal reflux disease. So if you've got an acidy stomach, Cytotec can work for that. So is the prescription for your acidy stomach in the 74-year-old man, or is it for his abortion? I also use it as a gynecologist. So when women have postmenopausal bleeding and their cervixes get little tiny and they need some help opening it up, I use this medication. So again, I can see things occurring where the Cytotec would not be filled because a pharmacist could fear that they're providing an illegal abortion in whatever state it's illegal. It is legal in North Carolina right now. We also use Cytotec for miscarriages. So the baby did have a heartbeat, it does not now. We use these exact same drugs. And to me, that is something that a doctor and a patient talk about and not a pharmacist or anyone else. And that I feel like people are coming into our doctor-patient relationship, and that's one of the things that I fear the most. So a surgical abortion, we call them DNCs, DVC, and DNEs. Essentially, it is a way to open the cervix and remove the products of conception. And this can be done from a few days to up to, in our institution, 20 weeks and 6 days, not institution, our state. But again, I can't even keep up with what's happening in the nation where it has been restricted, but to our state it's 20 weeks, 6 days. And there are different levels of procedures. So sometimes the cervix can open a few millimeters easily in the operating room, but you have to open it up a centimeter or 2. It takes multiple medications to open it so you can safely evacuate the uterus. So a D&E, the dilation and extraction, is where we see the second trimester terminations. And why would anyone want a second trimester termination other than they just don't want to be pregnant? So that does occur. But most second trimester terminations occur because a woman finds out that is a baby not compatible with life due to a certain genetic condition, or the ultrasound shows that it is not compatible with life. So a hypoplastic heart, so a shriveled up heart that's not going to beat on its own when it comes out. And you do not get that information till about 18 weeks. Okay, so Plan B is not an abortion pill. So Plan B, which also is Next Choice and Take Action, those are the brand names, is levonorgestrel. You are to take it within the first 72 hours of unprotected intercourse. It can be up to 5 days, but 12 hours is the most preferred. And what that does is inhibit ovulation. Sperm live a long time. I have 2 children because of that. I did not count correctly. 5-6 days, those things live. The eggs live very short. So if you can prohibit ovulation 5 days, most of those sperm will die off and you will not get pregnant. It is not intended to prevent implantation. That is why it is not an abortion pill. Second way is you can use high birth control pills in high doses. Then there's a lot more side effects. Estrogen has risks of stroke, deep vein thrombosis, nausea, headaches, things like that. But you can just use regular over-the-counter, not over-the-counter yet, birth control pills, and you can do them 12 hours apart. And Ella is new, and it's the #1 emergency contraception in Europe. And again, it's supposed to be taken in the same time frame within the first 72 hours. Also, to prevent pregnancy, you can insert a copper IUD, which causes the sperm to kind of freak out, and so they don't fertilize the egg. But again, that has to be done very, very quickly after unprotected intercourse or a condom breakage or what have you, whatever makes you want to prevent pregnancy. Next. So I think this was very interesting, but who gets an abortion? I think we all have in our mind the serial abortionist. She's on her 6th. That's actually not who gets an abortion in our country. Already a mother. Who's a mom out here? That's a lot of work, right? And so I tell my patients who are contemplating getting pregnant, consider getting pregnant just like you would consider getting a tattoo on your face. It is forever, right? So moms already know how hard it is to raise a child, and so that goes and informs their decision. She's in her late 20s, has attended some college, has low income, is unmarried, is usually in her first 6 weeks of pregnancy because she knows that she's missed her period. Is having her first abortion and lives in a blue state. So that is the demographics of people who get abortions in our nation. Okay, so how will the limit of abortion affect women? So women are smart. We're gonna figure this stuff out ourselves. We'll read things on Etsy or TikTok videos, and we will do things to ourselves to help ourselves out. Surgical procedures by lay healthcare workers. I think all these septic abortions we had before abortion was legal, they would go in and do surgical procedures and cause a lot of damage to women's uteruses and a lot of infection. And of course, after you've had a legal procedure, you go to a legal facility to get help. People usually delay care when they've done something illegal. Some people may be so worried they may get their tubes tied because they just can't bear having to go through all of this. And then we have tubal ligation regret. 25% of women who get their tubes tied before the age of 26 experience regret. Travel. So women will have to bear the financial burden of getting there, ED follow-ups, their mental health, delayed care because they can't get time off work for travel, an unwanted live birth. And this is where I find very interesting that we're really focusing on while the baby's in the womb, but when the baby gets out, what are we doing to make sure that moms and dads and children have all the resources they need to live a good life? So people who don't want to be pregnant get late prenatal care. That increases their risk of miscarriage, of low birth weight infants, postpartum depression, and also increase in psychological and physical violence between partners. People will be getting more IUDs, and this patient privacy thing. Oh, let's do it backwards. I don't know what I did. Okay. I have vague details of the story, and I know you know the story really well, Steve, but a little girl, a woman, young woman, was looking for a pregnancy test on Target, and some Target realized there was a pregnancy test, so it sent some recommendations for diapers to the mother's app. So Target knows when you're pregnant way before the rest of the world does. Did I kind of do okay with that one?
And actually, no, you did fine. The problem that occurred in Wisconsin was that they started sending info to the home, And the father said, this is ridiculous, my daughter's not pregnant, went and confronted the Target manager. And Target said, based on her buying preferences now, we believe she's pregnant. Father went home to confront daughter. Target knew before dad she was pregnant.
So that gets hold of that right of privacy. So if you go to a website, is someone be watching that and then send someone to your house? What can you surf? Where can you go to the library and look up at things? Do libraries still have things to look at anymore? Is everything still online? So it's just really, if you download an app, does someone track you? Because we're all being tracked, right? So men, and I use this term for transgender and non-binary people who make sperm. So it's people who, does that make clear? So I don't like to be exclusive. Okay. So 1 in 5 men have been involved in an abortion. And economically, young men who are involved with a pregnancy whose partners had an abortion were nearly 4 times more likely to graduate from college than those partners who gave birth. Who is going to educate our young men? Do you want to know how my husband educated our sons? And he's married to a physician. You know all about sex, don't you? How embarrassing. But I think we're relatively educated, but that was his idea of sex education for my sons. They got more from me. But if that's happening in my household, what is happening out in the rest of the community? And so again, if men want to prevent this from happening, because they're scared too, men have feelings, right? They don't want to cause harm. They don't want to be burdened. We may have, unnecessary vasectomies and regret. So the IVF is a $8 billion business, and about 83,000 births in 2019 were due to in vitro fertilization. And that is where you stimulate a woman's ovaries, take out her ovum, and now we almost always inject a sperm into the ovum. It gives it a better chance of making an embryo. Then they grow them to a certain number of cell levels. Sometimes they test them for genetics to make sure they're only putting back embryos that are genetically normal. And the rest they can go into a deep freeze in case that IVF cycle does not take, or they want future siblings. You can get sometimes 5, 10, 15 embryos in one cycle. Okay, so if life begins at conception, are we putting humans in freezers? What happens if the power goes out and all the embryos thaw and die? Is that a mass murder? So there'll be a lot of information around this, because the storage, disposal, genetic testing, are you hurting the baby if you're taking a cell out? So more to come on this. Some states have looked at this, some say it doesn't count, but I think it's a point of contention. If life begins when the egg meets the sperm, then how can you freeze some of them, and how can you not legislate those and have legislature over others? So more to come. Healthcare workers. So because we've lived in a post-Roe world for most of us that are practicing medicine, our diagnostic acumen for seeing, for a septic abortion or complications of unwanted pregnancies, it has gone down, right? Like even people that I train, they have no idea. It's just been a fact that you can get a termination. We don't see these very, very sick women coming in hemorrhaging to death. So when you come in at night, there's sometimes one team in the hospital. If they're doing an emergency surgery for someone who had a septic abortion, they're not doing the open heart surgery. They're not doing the stroke. They're not doing the trauma. So we will see our care. We're not there for abortion care, but we will be affected as healthcare citizens because our care will be delayed because we're doing more of these procedures. And this is so true. You'll see in the news now that even though you think you know, but you're so scared to be wrong, you know that would only get in trouble and maybe with your hospital, but now it's a felony in Texas. It's a felony. You could go to jail. You could lose your medical license, your ability to support your family. So what we're finding is getting ethics consults. Those take 3 days. And so we will see a delay in care, but then people will be scared they're going to be sued, or even worse, just harassed on the street. And there's a supply and demand of clinicians, and so you can already see people are going to set up shop for OB-GYN specifically. Some of those states that have outlawed abortion already may have a dearth of OB-GYNs that, to practice medicine. I'm a big burnout believer. That's a lot of things to be worried about, and it may just drive people out of the field of medicine forever. And there's something I call moral distress. So my job as an OB-GYN is to take care of my patient. And when I feel like I can't do that, it causes me moral distress. And once in a while, that's okay, but every night I'm on call, that's gonna get really old. Next. So businesses, peaceful workplace, if there's a difference of opinions at the water cooler. Risk management personnel will have to be trained in these types of issues. Recruitment and retention of non-healthcare businesses, they may not want to work in a state where it's illegal. How will a business a lot of the bigger businesses are self-insured, how will they know what is the cost of insuring their workforce if there's no really idea of prenatal care, covered lives, complications, travel? I think we'll see the businesses are not in the healthcare will still have a large say in this because it's going to affect who comes to their businesses to work and how much it's going to cost them for their healthcare insurance. Next. So our community, again, I talked a little bit about this when we talked about the ability for emergency surgery, but that'll also be, the ability for an ambulance, because these people will need an ambulance when they get sick enough. Our blood supply, I don't know if you see the advertisements for needing blood all the time, but we are chronically in shortage of blood, and women who have perforated uteruses use a lot of blood. Where will our tax dollar allocations go? Okay, so this was as of last night at the New York Times. These are all the states where it is now banned. And what we are seeing actually here, people are coming to our state now for terminations, and there's actually, they're searching for providers to perform them because there's already not enough slots. Okay, and then I don't know how I'm doing on time. So this was a woman in Houston who had a partial molar pregnancy. That's when two sperm enter one egg, and it has the wrong number of chromosomes. Unfortunately, it can produce a baby that will not live. It's most of the time dies in utero, but what also happens is the placenta grows out of control and just multiplies and multiplies and multiplies. That sounds like cancer, right? That's exactly what that becomes, is cancer. But if that baby in there has a heartbeat, this woman was putting her risk at cancer because they would not terminate her pregnancy. They're also at risk for massive hemorrhage. I just had one, she was a complete mole, but I just had one a few months ago, and it was one of the largest blood losses I have ever seen in 22 years of practicing medicine. So eventually she did get the care that she needed, but everyone was torn up about this because there was a heartbeat, even though there was this cancerous placenta that could kill her. And this lady, she actually had a miscarriage before Roe v. Wade was overturned, and she got to have a D&C, a D&E. So the baby had a heartbeat, didn't have a heartbeat, and they did the D&C, and she had a very good experience. Unfortunately, really wants a baby. 8 months later, she had another miscarriage. But they didn't know if they could do a D&C, and she had to fight for her right for a D&C. They told her to go home, and when you fill up a diaper every hour, come back, because now we know your life is in danger enough. Not right now. Not right now when we can avoid a blood transfusion. Not right now while you're here and obviously distraught that you lost your baby, but only when life-threatening hemorrhage is occurring. And what does that do with our healthcare resources? That's it. Ending on that happy note.
Them up. We're going to start off with a couple of questions. Do the strict constitutional judges Mr. Friedland, have a problem in that their authority to interpret law is not in the Constitution?
I think that's a really good question. Well, this isn't working, but it doesn't matter. There's different ways of interpreting the Constitution. Some people look at what they call originalism. They should look at the text and what was originally meant. The problem, of course, is you can't kind of stick to that, including it doesn't even say in the Constitution that you have the power to interpret it. So whatever category you're in, you can't really justify it completely. And when you read a judicial opinion, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to justify their conclusion, their outcome. It's how they're solving a problem. But yeah, okay, it's working now. Okay, he wants it for the mic. So bottom line is, there's going to be a lot of inconsistencies here. We tried pointing them out, but they're going to say, as Justice Alito says, this goes beyond what the judges ought to interpret as implying into the Constitution. Therefore, we're not going to do it. But I think there's a slippery slope here. You can see once you start down that line, now what about this, that, and the other thing? Just like IVF, I think is a really important area. I teach criminal law. And now, what happens if someone is taking the embryos and putting them into the freezer and they drop one? Sounds like murder. What happens if they only injure it? Attempted murder. What happens if someone who's pregnant goes out for a drink? Sorry, if you're endangering life that way, you can say child endangerment, if you're going to view it that way. We now have a whole host of other legal issues that you need to deal with.
Somebody is concerned about diminished efficacy of Plan B for patients with higher body weight, higher BMIs.
Someone's very smart. Yes, and so the Ella, the one that was new to me, the one that's used in Europe, is better for women with heavier weights. And it is prescription, it is available here. It probably is not on many formularies, so it'd be very expensive. The other option is to use that high-dose birth control, which there are certain birth controls that are on the $9 Walmart list, and that could do what you need it to be done. So most people can afford that, but yes, there is an efficacy issue with high BMIs.
And follow up, how expensive are those initial medicines?
Reasonable, especially if you use the $9 Walmart. I think Plan B it's in the double digits. I'm embarrassed I don't know the exact cost of it, but it is over the counter. I don't know if your Flex card would pay for it, but usually I would think it would.
But if you went for the preferred first on your list, how much would that be?
The Plan B? That's the what? The Ella?
The MIF, and I should know.
Okay, so Plan B or the abortion drugs?
Right.
Okay, so the mifepristone is about $450 a dose, and the Cytotec is like 25 cents. And so the mifepristone is only at certain pharmacies and very difficult to get.
Another for you. Do state constitutions typically have a privacy right like the 14th Amendment?
Some do. States have their own constitutions. They have to be consistent with the federal constitution. We already talked about feds and states, but they can go further. And some state constitutions do go further, and many have privacy rights. So if it's in the Constitution there, they can. But you can see by what Dr. Leggett showed, a lot of states may have privacy. It does not include the right to choose to have an abortion.
If we pass the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, would that change anything?
I think it would change a lot, but it wouldn't change abortion.
Okay. Why can't pregnant women lie about when their dates are? Why can't pregnant women lie about when they got pregnant?
They can, and ultrasound is really sensitive. And so you must confirm there's an intrauterine pregnancy because a pregnancy could be ectopic. And so it could be in your fallopian tube. So using these medications when you don't know exactly where the pregnancy is could delay care, because those aren't the medications to fix an ectopic pregnancy. We use methotrexate for that. So let's say it is in the uterus. You can say your last menstrual period was, 1 day ago, but if the baby measures, 2 centimeters, we know that it's not.
Should a judicial election be partisan or nonpartisan?
That's an easy one for me. Judges are supposed to be objective, and so they definitely should not be partisan, and I don't believe they should have a party listed under their names. The real issue is, should they be elected or appointed? I think both have problems, and a bipartisan commission is very useful that some states are using.
But what do we have right now?
We do have elections, and you can see that the party is listed.
Okay. Let's see. Are there any lawsuits pending regarding present embryo handling, such as you presented? You presented the possibility of problems, but are there any lawsuits pending that would address that question?
Well, the Texas law is being used as a model by other states, and they are very far-reaching. Actually, law can be enforced by third parties, so that if someone doesn't like what other people are doing, they can bring a lawsuit. So it's very extensive, and I don't know of any particular cases, but they're going to happen.
Okay. I'm going to take my prerogative of being up here and ask my question, and then there are those who believe that life begins at conception, and there are those who want abortion on demand. And there are a lot of us in between, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. Senator Lindsey Graham has recently presented a bill for consideration of a nationwide ban on abortion after 15 weeks. Considering the age of viability outside the womb and considerations of maternal health and well-being, what would you propose? And I would also like to hear your answer if you have one.
So medically, the first genetic test can be done at 12 weeks, and it takes 7 to 10 business days. So 2 weeks to get the results back. So now we're at 14 weeks. And then you would get, maybe this genetic test is a blood test out of you, and it has a certain probability. And then you would need to get an amniocentesis to be sure of this genetic condition. That takes, a fish can take, can be a certain genetic test can be done very quickly. The chromosome array takes much longer. So now we're at beyond the 15 weeks. Plus, there's probably zero availability for same-day services, given we can't get same-day services for ingrown toenails, right? So that 15-week does not give women the choice to have a genetic test and act on it. And then we also discussed that anatomy is done at 18 weeks, where a vast majority of abnormalities are picked up. And so that would negate that portion of women being able to choose. And you were right, viability means when can the baby live outside the womb? And we have national reports of 22 weeks and 0 days. Locally, we're more about 23 weeks. And so saving a baby at 20 weeks, or delivering the baby at 20 weeks, you're not going to do you can't do anything with it. There's not an intubation tube small enough to go down, the lungs are not going to support it. So viability to me makes a big difference of when life begins, because even if you wanted to save, or we do want to save babies at 20 weeks, because some babies are very highly desired and it's an accident they came out. And so, but we can't. We don't have the technology.
And I would just say, I think the Constitution is really about our values. That's what it reflects. And the right to privacy is a big value. What does it mean? And how we interpret it is really what our discussion's about. Does it mean freedom from disclosure, or does it mean autonomy, the right to choose? And if it means autonomy, you know what people would say about this law and laws in states, This is about if it's an individual right, states and the federal government should keep out.
One person wanted to point out that they believe that everyone at the Second Constitutional Convention in 1787 to 1788 was male, white, and owned slaves. Maybe not owned slaves, but I would say...
They were all landowners, which was really important.
Yes. One person wanted to know if there's some way we could, and this may be for us, is anything being done to educate our legislators in Raleigh about this?
They haven't called me personally, but I do know there are groups like the NC Ob-Gyn Association, ACOG, American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. They have delegates to do these things. I'm just not part of that.
And I do believe that I think people should know their rights. I think that it's amazing how many high school and college students don't know what their rights are when the police stop them. And we need to start looking at that because that's so important. And you have on your tables, as Rob is holding up, the list of our representatives. And I think the representatives, again, they're very motivated these days by the political team they're on. And I don't think we've gotten to the point of really understanding the facts, and particularly the law and what it really means, and how these cases affect us, which they do.
And I'm going to finish on this because it's sort of interesting. Ben Franklin had a recipe for abortion in his Poor Richard's Almanac. Does it work?
Probably. No, I don't know. I've never, I'd like to look that up. So
I think it is interesting that I don't think there were any laws against abortion or punishing somebody who did abortion at that early stage.
Well, that actually is what Dobbs was about. And Justice Alito has a very different viewpoint than Justice Kagan, for example, on what the history is. We talk about the history, and we can go into it. How did the courts find out what our history was, what the laws were? Ben Franklin had this. There's, I think, a real question here.
I want to thank everyone for attending. If you have any more questions, I'm hoping our presenters might stay for 5 minutes to answer them, and we hope you'll be back with us next month.